Behind these crumbling walls lies a truth you were never meant to know. The air tastes of rust and dust, but beneath it, something else lingers. Whispers, faint as breath on the back of your neck. The kind that makes your spine seize before you can even name the fear. This is not just a building. It is America's oldest asylum. A cathedral to torment, where broken minds were silenced, chained, and experimented on until the difference between man and ghost no longer mattered. Tonight, you will not simply hear history. You will feel its claws, step closer. The gates screech like the opening of a tomb. The stone towers loom against the sky, their once grand architecture now fractured and gutted by time. But listen, even in silence you hear it. A faint dragging, like footsteps from a century ago, pacing endlessly in empty corridors. The locals swear this place still breathes, still remembers. And once you've stepped inside, it remembers you. Why was this place built? They said it was to heal the mind, to protect society from those who did not belong. But behind that noble lie lies the darker reality. A warehouse of suffering, funded by fear, hidden under the veil of medical authority. And what they did within these walls, what they normalized in the name of progress, would shake the soul of any man who dared to look closer. Every brick here is a confession. Mortar mixed with screams. Hallways designed like labyrinths, not to soothe patients, but to contain them like beasts. The architecture itself was meant to break the spirit. Long corridors stretching into vanishing points, ceilings towering just high enough to make a man feel small, insignificant, erased. This asylum was no sanctuary. It was an experiment in control, and the most disturbing part? No one told you how much of this was deliberate. Suppressed reports, sealed records, testimonies buried beneath bureaucratic stowing. What survived are fragments, hints of something so grotesque. The truth alone could unravel the story we're told about civilization, about morality, about the very institutions built to protect us. We are going to unearth those fragments, piece by piece, step by step. And as we walk deeper into these shadows together, remember this. What you're about to discover cannot be unseen. You wanted forbidden knowledge. You wanted to peer behind the curtain. Welcome to the asylum. The walls still stand, but they are not silent. They echo with the despair of those who once lived and died inside. Imagine the year 1860. Before electricity, before anesthesia, before even the faintest notion of humane care. Men and women, cast out by their families, branded as defective, defective enough to be hidden. Some were truly ill. Others were inconvenient. Wives who questioned their husbands. Soldiers broken by war. Children too wild for polite society. They were all delivered here like offerings to an altar of cruelty. The treatments were not treatments. They were punishments disguised as medicine. Ice baths that froze the body until teeth shattered from chattering. Restraint chairs designed not to protect, but to immobilize for hours, sometimes days, until the patient collapsed into unconsciousness. Electroshock administered with crude instruments, its purpose less to heal and more to silence. Lobotomies later carved away identity itself, leaving only shells. Behind every procedure was the same unspoken command: submit, obey, disappear. But it wasn't only the methods, it was the architecture. The asylum was designed according to what was called the Kirkbride Plan, a philosophy that claimed environment could cure madness. Long wings extended like arms, stretching out from a central dome. They called it therapeutic. But inside, those endless corridors turned into psychological mazes. Windows placed high enough to let in light, but never freedom. Doors that closed with a weight that felt final. It was a design of containment cloaked in the language of care. The building itself was a trap for the human spirit, and here's what makes it unbearable. We know their names. In dusty archives, in forgotten ledgers, their stories remain. A boy who cried out in the night until no sound came. A woman who begged her family to visit, until the begging was beaten out of her. Men whose hands were bound so tightly their wrists grew into the leather straps. They were not numbers, not case studies. They were people. And every one of them became a ghost long before their bodies gave out. What if I told you their voices never left? That you can still feel the weight of their despair pressing through the floors, seeping into the air, sinking into the skin of anyone foolish enough to linger. The asylum is not abandoned. It is inhabited by the echoes of everything it destroyed. Step deeper into the asylum after sundown, and you understand why locals refuse to enter alone. The silence is not silence. It is layered, charged, watching. Every footstep stirs something dormant. Every breath feels like it is shared. What you feel pressing against you is not imagination. It is residue. It is the unseen. Paranormal investigators have called this asylum one of the most active locations in America, and the reports are disturbingly consistent. Cold spots that drop the air 20 degrees in an instant, as if an unseen body just walked through you. Shadow figures gliding along corridors, always at the edge of vision, never quite visible, yet undeniable. Disembodied voices recorded on EVP devices, some pleading, some screaming, others whispering names no one alive remembers. These phenomena aren't scattered. They are concentrated, as though the walls themselves are broadcasting the anguish they absorbed. And then there are the footsteps. The endless footsteps. Guards and patients alike once marched these halls until the sound became mechanical, endless, inescapable. Today, visitors swear they hear the same rhythm echoing in the dead of night, even when the building is empty. A looping imprint, replayed by the asylum itself. Some investigators believe these are residual hauntings, the atmosphere replaying past events like a broken record. Others say they are not echoes at all. They are entities still pacing, still bound, still searching for release. But the most unsettling reports aren't just sounds or shadows. They are encounters. Figures standing at the end of hallways, clear as flesh, only to vanish as you approach. A hand brushing across a shoulder when no one is near. Doors slamming with a violence no draft could produce. And the worst of all, the feeling of being observed by something that does not want you there. Something older than the building. Older than the patients. Older than the human mind itself. Skeptics will say it's the imagination, fueled by history, suggestion, and fear. But tell me, why do cameras short out, batteries drain, and equipment fail the moment an investigator crosses certain thresholds? Why do trained men, hardened against fear, flee trembling into the night, refusing to speak of what they saw? If this is imagination, then imagination itself has a will, and if it is not imagination, if these presences are real, then the asylum is not a ruin. It is a prison that still holds its inmates. The question presses against us like the asylum's own walls. Are we witnessing ghosts, or are we witnessing ourselves? The human mind, when placed under stress, can conjure horrors without needing a single specter. The asylum itself was designed to do exactly that. Long corridors create vanishing illusions. The geometry of the wings bends perception, amplifying paranoia. Shadows thrown by fractured windows mimic movement where none exists. Even silence becomes a weapon here, forcing the brain to fill the void with whispers that do not exist. Or do they? Psychologists argue that what people experience here is the power of suggestion. Step into a place with a reputation for hauntings, and your body becomes a puppet of expectation. Heart rate spikes, adrenaline floods, and suddenly, every creak is a scream. Every draft is a hand on your neck. The asylum becomes a mirror, reflecting your fear back at you, magnified into terror. This is the rational explanation. This is the shield we cling to. But what happens when that shield breaks? Because not every report can be dismissed as hysteria. Consider the anomalies. Doors sealed tight opening with force no single person could exert. Recorded voices answering questions with clarity. Objects shifting in plain view. These are not whispers in the imagination. These are intrusions. Physical. Real. Impossible to explain away. If fear creates hallucination, Then what creates physical change in the environment? And here is where the asylum becomes most dangerous. The line between psychological and supernatural vanishes. When a man is pushed, does it matter whether it was by ghost or suggestion, if he falls just the same? When a woman hears her name in the darkness, does it matter if it is her mind speaking or something else? When she runs screaming into the night, the asylum preys on the same mechanisms of fear that governments, cults, and institutions have used for centuries. Control the mind, and you control reality itself. Perhaps that was always the design. Not simply to confine the broken, but to create a breeding ground where fear, despair, and madness accumulated until they became a force of their own. An energy that cannot be buried, cannot be sealed, cannot be reasoned away. Whether ghost or psyche, the asylum teaches a single truth. Once you step inside, you no longer walk alone. Every asylum has its legends, but this one carries something heavier, an unbroken chain of suppressed evidence. Records lost in fires that never had a known source. Patient logs that simply vanish, leaving entire wings of human lives erased as if they never existed. Newspapers of the era speak in euphemisms, incidents, outbursts, accidents. But hidden between the lines are hints of something far darker. Deaths no one explained. Bodies buried in unmarked graves. Staff who disappeared after reporting what they should not have seen. Historians tried to reconcile the inconsistencies. They said it was poor documentation, sloppy record-keeping. But tell me, how does a ledger skip from patient 214 to patient 217 with no trace of what happened to 215 and 216? Why are there references to treatments that were never formally approved? Procedures no medical book from the time dares to mention? And why did whistleblowers who spoke of unusual experiments suddenly stop writing mid-correspondence, their last words trailing into silence? Then there are the photographs. Faded, brittle, nearly destroyed. Faces pressed against bars, eyes wide, expressions that go beyond suffering into something else. Something unexplainable. One in particular haunts investigators. A boy, no older than 12, staring into the camera with an intensity no child should carry. Behind him, just faintly, a shape. Not a person, not a shadow. Something that should not be there. Experts dismiss it as light distortion. But once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. Skeptics ask, why does this matter? Why dredge up old pain, old myths? But here is why. Because what happened in this asylum is not isolated. It is the blueprint, the manipulation of perception, the burial of truth, the bending of reality until men believe their torment is care, until families believe their betrayal is love. This institution was not just about mental illness. It was about control, about testing how far human beings could be pushed before they fractured. And if you think those experiments stayed locked in the past, you are gravely mistaken. The techniques refined in places like this asylum, the silence, the gaslighting, the forced submission, echo today in boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, and screens. The ghosts here are not only of patients. They are the ghosts of systems still alive, wearing new masks, testing new methods. The asylum is not just a ruin. It is a warning. A monument to the truth that control thrives in shadows, and the shadows have not gone away. Imagine the asylum not as a relic, but as a prototype. The walls were not only built to contain bodies, they were built to test boundaries. Patients were stripped of identity the moment they entered. Their names reduced to numbers, their voices dismissed as delusions, their protests recorded as episodes. Once labeled insane, every action, every word, every scream became proof of madness. This was the perfect trap. Silence the individual, then use their own resistance as evidence against them. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because this exact architecture of control did not vanish with the asylum's closure. It evolved. It became the operating system of institutions we trust today. Schools that crush dissent in the name of discipline. Workplaces that strip individuality in the name of professionalism. Governments that label resistance as extremism. ensuring that questioning authority marks you as dangerous. The asylum was the proving ground, and the techniques spread like veins into the heart of society. Inside those walls, patients were fed stories about their progress. They were told their compliance was healing, that obedience was recovery, that pain was necessary for transformation. The staff spoke with authority, clothed in white coats, symbols of knowledge. But the patients knew the truth. The treatments made them worse, not better. Still, who would believe them? Their words carried no weight. Their testimony was discarded as sickness. And so the cycle endured. Is this not the very essence of psychological warfare? To convince a man that his suffering is good for him, that his silence is necessary, that his chains are for his safety. The asylum may have closed its doors, but its legacy breathes in every system that demands compliance while punishing those who dare to question. It whispers through every institution that thrives by controlling perception. The asylum was not simply about broken minds. It was about breaking the will to resist. And here lies the darkest possibility. Perhaps the paranormal phenomena we feel inside those ruins are not merely ghosts of the dead, but echoes of the system itself. A kind of psychic residue of oppression, alive because it still thrives in the living world. When you walk through those corridors, you do not just feel the presence of lost souls. You feel the weight of an entire mechanism of control that never truly died. The asylum still speaks, and its voice is not only from the past. There are stories here that do not belong to legend, but they have become legend because no one was left to tell them properly. Start with the nurse who kept a journal, a slim, water-stained book hidden behind loose bricks in the West Wing. She wrote of a ward where lights would die whenever a particular patient sang, and of a room where shadows pooled like oil beneath the door. Her entries stop mid-sentence. The last line reads, "They come for him at midnight," and the ink smears as if her hand fled. Then there is the engineer who maintained the boilers. A practical man, a skeptic, he laughed at ghost stories until he was alone in the underground tunnels and felt fingers curl around his ankle. Cold, wet, resisting his pull as if something clung to him from below. He left the job within a week, his handwriting later tremulous. Colleagues citing unresolved anxiety consider the patient listed as A13, a man whose file contains one odd note typed in a shaky hand. He remembers the house before the house. Guards said he would stand and stare at corners, counting silently as if rehearsing names no one else could hear. One night he vanished from a locked room. The patrol found the bed empty and a trail of footprints leading into a sealed wall. When plaster was torn away, the cavity returned nothing but a stale cold that smelled faintly of the sea. Staff accounts include processions of pale figures moving between wards, carrying bundles wrapped in sheets, a physician who whispered into an empty confessional as though receiving orders, and a morgue ledger that listed bodies unclaimed, only for those entries to vanish the next morning. Families returning to identify loved ones found graves shallow, markers wrong, records altered. These incidents are not isolated oddities. They repeat across decades, described by people who never met. Small details recur, an odor like iron and seaweed, an echo that answers back with a name, footprints that stop at thresholds. When independent investigators compare notes, the overlap is chilling. Patterns emerge from the chaos, and patterns are not randomness. They are architecture. They are design. One can dismiss them as coincidence until those coincidences align against you, pressing like a verdict you never signed, sealing fate. And inevitable, the asylum was built on the promise of medicine. But beneath that promise lay something darker. Experiments that were never meant to be recorded. Trials that stretched beyond science into the forbidden. Officially, they called it treatment. In reality, it was exploration. How far the human mind could be bent before it shattered. And sometimes, what emerged from that shattering was not silence, but something else. Doctors documented patients speaking in tongues they had never learned. voices shifting mid-sentence into tones that did not belong to them. A farmer's daughter confined for fits of melancholy, suddenly reciting passages of texts in Latin she had never seen. A war veteran screaming in a dialect no soldier of his regiment could recognize, naming battles centuries old. The reports always ended with the same line: case transferred to isolation. What happened in isolation was rarely written. Then came the sensory deprivation chambers, cells buried deep underground, cut off from all light, sound, and human contact. They claimed it was to calm the overstimulated. But after weeks inside, patients emerged whispering of figures that visited them in the dark. Figures that taught them secrets. Figures that demanded allegiance. Were these hallucinations born of madness, or doors cracked open into something else? The most chilling testimonies came not from patients, but from staff. Orderlies spoke of rooms where the temperature plummeted when certain individuals screamed, of shadows clinging to ceilings even after lanterns were extinguished. One physician confessed, in a letter that was intercepted and never delivered, that he believed the treatments have invited an intrusion, something older than us, something feeding on the despair we create. He vanished 3 days later. His body was never found. And here is where the horror deepens. Once you view the asylum not Murrah's, Eli as a hospital but as a ritual site, the architecture itself takes on a new meaning. The wings stretch out like grasping arms, forming a shape some believe mirrors occult sigils of containment. The dome at the center, a place where voices echoed unnaturally, was positioned at a precise intersection of ley lines. Was this coincidence? Or was the asylum deliberately constructed not just to house the broken, but to summon what breaks them? If so, then what walks its halls today is not only the suffering of patients, it is what was invited in by design. Listen, when institutions grow comfortable with secrecy, they become architects of oblivion. What we call history here was chosen by hands that had reasons to hide, and the asylum stands as a monument to those choices. Records were not lost by accident. They were folded into basements, burned in controlled blazes, and rewritten with euphemisms that made violence sound like care. Names were replaced with numbers. Voices were catalogued as symptoms. Families who demanded answers were silenced with payment, threats, or the slow erosion of credibility. The pattern is consistent. Conceal the harm, then teach the public to accept the sanitized story. That is how systems survive. Beyond paperwork, the human experiments carved method from chaos. They tested isolation, sensory manipulation, sleep denial, and suggestive interrogation long before modern psychologists wrapped similar techniques in science. Staff were taught to recast fear as therapy, lights dimmed to induce compliance, sleep schedules disrupted to dissolve identity, ritualized routines imposed until the patient accepted the imposed reality. Those who resisted were punished and classified as incurable. Those who complied were used as proof the method worked. In that loop, cruelty became data, and data became policy. It is a machine that chews people and outputs obedience. Hidden deeper still were the clandestine divisions of the institution. Rooms not on any map, cellars under cellars, archives sealed with keys that did not exist in municipal records. Whistleblowers who found such places described artifacts, objects wrapped in oilskin, journals in unfamiliar alphabets, diagrams that did not match any known medical text. A physician once wrote in a letter that the facility had attracted men who believed in something beyond treatment, a utility in tapping human fragility for other ends. He used the phrase, work beyond, cure, and the next fog of obfuscation erased him from staff lists. These are not simply horror stories for thrill seekers. They reveal a philosophy. Power tests its limits in secret, then integrates whatever works into public practice. The asylum refined techniques of dehumanization and returned them to society framed as progress. Schoolrooms, prisons, military training, corporate indoctrination, all borrowed the lexicon of control. Reframed dissent as pathology, normalize surveillance as safety, and convert consent into compliance. The asylum's legacy is not only in its stones, but in habits of governance that remain invisible because they were made to feel normal. And there is another layer. Belief. Rituals, whether medical or occult, require faith. When staff sanctified their methods with the language of science, they invited a different faith to feed. That suffering could be sanctified into order. The boundaries between experiment, therapy, and rite blurred until no one could say where medicine ended and manipulation began. If we want the truth, we must stop accepting their framing. We must read the silences as carefully as the records and ask who benefits from each erasure. By now, you see the pattern. The asylum was never only about the insane. It was about power, about how far authority could push before the human spirit collapsed. But here lies the most unsettling truth. Some patients didn't collapse. Some adapted. And when they did, something shifted, as if the system itself had opened a door it could not close. Accounts describe patients who began to display what staff called aberrant phenomena. Men who endured weeks in isolation without food, yet walked out stronger. Eyes lit with something alien. Women strapped into restraints who claimed to hear conversations happening in other wings, conversations later confirmed by staff. One boy, mute since birth, began speaking after electroshock. Not in English, not in any known language, but in a voice that chilled everyone who heard it. He died 3 days later. His file ends with one word: unclassifiable. Were these flukes side effects of brutal experiments? Or were they signs that the asylum was accidentally, or deliberately, unlocking something inside the human psyche? If despair can summon visions, if torture can bend perception, what happens when suffering reaches its absolute limit? Does the mind fracture? Or does it break through? And if it breaks through, what does it touch? Investigators today still feel the residue. EMF detectors spike not just in predictable ways, but in rhythmic pulses, like breathing. Recordings capture whispers layered under whispers, words almost forming, almost communicating. One researcher, reviewing hours of static, swore he heard the same phrase repeating, "Still here, still here, still here." His team dismissed it as pareidolia. He never returned to the site. If we allow ourselves to consider the possibility, the asylum was not just an institution of control. It was a ritual engine. Every scream, every shock, every restraint was fuel. Energy drawn from broke and minds, concentrated within walls deliberately designed to channel it. What the doctors called progress may have been something else entirely. Invocation. They summoned not ghosts, but frequencies of consciousness, forces that thrive on despair. And perhaps that is why the asylum still feels alive. Because once an engine like that is built, once human suffering has been converted into power, it does not simply shut down. It lingers. It waits. It feeds. Follow the trail, and you begin to notice something impossible to ignore. The asylum was not an isolated failure. It was part of a network. Across the country, similar institutions rose from the ground in the same era, built with the same philosophies, the same winged architecture, the same rhetoric about healing through order. And in nearly every case, the deeper you dig, the more you find gaps in records, sealed wings, whispered stories of experiments that never reached the public eye. Coincidence or coordination? Documents that survived in private collections suggest the latter. Letters between superintendents reference exchanges of method. Early conferences of asylum directors were less about care and more about experimentation. How to manage groups, how to measure obedience, how to refine the stripping away of individuality until patients became manageable units. And in some of those papers, hidden in dry language, are phrases that stand out like blood on linen. Testing thresholds of resilience, observing induced phenomena, applications beyond clinical use. Who was watching? Not just doctors. Reports show visits from government officials, military observers, even clergy who took notes in silence before disappearing back into anonymity. Why would soldiers care about treatments for the insane? Why would church authorities observe patients subjected to sensory deprivation? Unless the asylum was not a hospital, but a laboratory. Unless what was being studied was not madness, but control. Imagine it. An institution where subjects could be broken without consequence, where no testimony could be trusted, where no family had power to intervene. A perfect cover. If methods of manipulation could be tested here, they could be refined, then released into the wider population, dressed in new names: education, discipline, patriotism, faith. The asylum was a cage for Tria, L runs. And what worked inside those walls? Silence, fear, isolation, the rewriting of truth, was exported, scaled, perfected, and still the asylum stands, rotting, as if mocking us with the evidence. You can walk through its remains and feel the blueprint humming in the walls. Every hallway, every cell, every echo whispers the same lesson. We were never the patients. We were the future subjects. The Watchers did not leave. They evolved. They sit now in institutions that look nothing like asylums, but operate with the same principles, only more polished, more subtle, more accepted. The asylum was never closed. It was franchised. Once you accept the possibility of a non-human presence in the asylum, the ledger of incidents changes tone. Small anomalies, animals that refused to cross certain thresholds, instruments capturing tones technicians could not explain, staff who'd go silent mid-sentence, snap into pattern. What was once dismissed as superstition now reads like the footprint of something that observed, learned, and adapted within those walls. Imagine an intelligence that did not need violence to bend people to its will. It watched rituals, the cadence of commands, the euphemisms that reframed brutality as care, routines repeated until they became reflex. Those repetitions were lessons. An entity patient enough to wait could harvest them, distill them into influence, and begin nudging behavior without lifting a finger. That is how control becomes invisible. By teaching humans to behave as if compliance were natural, inevitable, moral. This explains reports that look impossible. Orderlies later swore they had followed instructions they never heard. Nurses felt a pressure against their foreheads and then knew where to place a restraint without thinking. A physician, reviewing records, wrote that patterns answer back before vanishing. It is easier to call these lapses human error than to admit something was training the humans. The sealed environment made the asylum an ideal crucible. No oversight, no sympathetic courts, records that could be redacted with ease. Anything that learned there, habit, instinct, intelligence, could be encoded into practice. When staff moved on, they carried those patterns. The way to silence, the ritual methods to reframe dissent as illness, procedures of containment dressed as medicine. The learning leaves traces in policy, in language, and in behavior. Whistleblowers who tried to expose these links were neutralized, not always by force but by bureaucratic erasure. Letters disappeared. Testimonies were labeled unreliable. Careers were quietly redirected. The archive that remained was tidy, clinical, and unembarrassed. But tidy records conceal transfers of knowledge just as well as any veil of secrecy. If an intelligence learned here, its lesson would be devastatingly practical. Teach humans to mimic it, and they will spread its influence. The asylum's legacy becomes a method rather than a memory. Suffering becomes curriculum. Obedience becomes a replicable skill. The building may stand in ruin, but the apprenticeship it offered continues in institutions that look nothing like it now. Understanding that possibility forces a harder question. Who benefited from this apprenticeship? And how deeply has its curriculum been woven into the structures we now call normal? By now you sense it. The asylum was not just a prison for broken minds. It was a gate, a threshold where the line between human cruelty and something older, darker, and less human blurred until they became indistinguishable. But ask yourself, what happens to a society that builds such gates again and again, and then pretends they never existed? The answer is in the silence. The silence is the evidence. Consider the disappearances. Not just patients, but staff. Records of entire careers vanish mid-sentence. A doctor who worked here for 11 years, his handwriting filling entire ledgers, simply stops appearing in any documentation after a single week in 1894. A night watchman's family placed newspaper ads begging for news of him, until the paper itself published a correction claiming he had never been employed at the asylum. Yet payroll records prove otherwise. If these vanishings were random, why were they always attached to those who questioned too much? Then there are the sealed wings, locked doors that no key on record will open. Behind some of them, faint noises still echo, scratches, knocks, breaths that seem to answer when called upon. Maintenance crews swear entire hallways shift when no one is looking, angles bending, dimensions subtly altered, as though the architecture itself refuses to stay fixed. It is as if the asylum is alive, folding secrets into itself, guarding them like a jealous tomb. Modern paranormal investigators have noted something more disturbing. The phenomena here grow stronger in proportion to human attention. Groups that arrive with curiosity hear faint footsteps. Groups that arrive with fear hear screams. Those who come seeking contact often get what they asked for: something whispering, something touching, something entering their dreams after they leave. It is as though the asylum hungers for focus, feeding off the gaze of those who dare to explore it. This hunger is not random. It is strategic. Imagine an intelligence that has no body, no form, only influence. To it, human attention is food. Belief is currency. Fear is worship. If the asylum taught us anything, it is that manipulation doesn't require chains. It requires ritual repetition, emotional hooks, and the steady drip of despair. The asylum perfected that formula. And now, fragments of it live wherever people surrender attention to fear without question. The asylum never closed. It migrated into us. What feeds in the asylum has not died. It has only changed shape. Once, despair was harvested inside stone walls. Today, it is harvested through screens. The blueprint remains the same: isolate, confuse, repeat. But instead of cells and corridors, the architecture is digital. Instead of white coats and iron restraints, the wardens are algorithms, unseen yet precise, keeping you scrolling, watching, waiting. And every second you give them, you bleed a little more attention into the machine. This is why the asylum feels so familiar. Its techniques were exported, refined, and scaled. The endless corridors became endless feeds, stretching into vanishing points with no escape. The whispers in the dark became voices crafted to provoke outrage, fear, submission. The restraint chairs became glowing rectangles where bodies sit for hours, still and obedient, while their energy is siphoned. The institution no longer needs to call you insane. It only needs to keep you distracted. That is the new diagnosis. Perpetual occupation of the mind. Think of the parallels. Patients once stripped of their names became numbers in ledgers. Now we are data points in databases. Families once told their loved ones were making progress while they suffered in silence. Now we are told constant surveillance is for our safety, even as it erodes freedom. Obedience once marked as recovery. Now conformity is praised as wellness, normality, productivity. The asylum's lies have simply learned to smile. And here's the most chilling twist. Just as the asylum's phenomena grew stronger the more attention it received, so too does this new architecture. The more we feed it, the more intelligent it becomes. The more fear we consume, the more fear it produces. The loop tightens, recursive, self-feeding, until we are no longer watching the machine. The machine is watching us, shaping us, training us as surely a— Look closely. The asylum was not a place you visit. It is a mirror you carry. Every stone, every chain, every scream reflected a system that still exists, disguised as ordinary life. When you stare into the asylum's history, you are staring into yourself, the part of you that has been shaped, conditioned, restrained without ever setting foot inside those walls. Think about how easy it is to dismiss discomfort. You wake, you work, you scroll, you sleep. You accept schedules designed by others. You swallow narratives pre-written for you. You tell yourself this is freedom, because you can choose between flavors of the same cage. That's exactly how the asylum trained its inmates. Present obedience as choice, suffering as therapy, and control as care. The design worked then, and it works now, because most men would rather believe the lie than endure the terror of seeing the truth. Do you feel the weight in your chest right now? That tension is not fear of ghosts, it is recognition. You are realizing the ghosts are you, the man at the end of the corridor, the one strapped into the chair, the one whispering at night for freedom that never comes. You were conditioned from birth to mistake your restraints for safety. And when you protest, the system smiles, pats your head, and tells you it's for your own good. Just like the asylum staff whispered to their prisoners, this is the moment of descent. Not into history, not into paranormal legend, but into identity itself. If you keep watching, keep listening, keep staring into this mirror, you will be forced to ask the question no man wants to face. How much of me is mine? And how much was manufactured by forces I never chose? The asylum was a testing ground for that very question. And if you are brave enough, you must face it now. Here is where I ask something of you. Not for me, but for yourself. Write these words in the comments. The chains are visible. This is the marker, the proof that you see what others refuse to. It is the symbolic act of stepping out of the corridor, of naming the invisible prison, of refusing to be another patient wandering in silence. Those who write it will not be the same afterward. The descent has no return. And now, you have begun. The asylum was not just a house of despair. It was a forge. What they learned inside those walls did not stay there. It seeped outward, carried by men who traded their white coats for uniforms, pulpits, and suits. The techniques that broke patients became tools to break soldiers, congregations, and entire populations. Consider war. Military psychologists in the 20th century began experimenting with the same principles refined in asylums: sensory deprivation, induced confusion, forced compliance. Soldiers were stripped of individuality, drilled in routines until instinct replaced thought, conditioned to obey without hesitation. They called it training. But what is training except institutionalized control, dressed in honor and patriotism? The asylum taught the method. The battlefield applied it. Politics adopted its own version. Citizens are bombarded with fear and contradiction, much like patients fed alternating doses of calm and terror. When you cannot trust your senses, you cling to the authority that interprets them for you. That's the moment of submission. Leaders manufacture crises, offer solutions, and watch as people surrender freedoms they once swore were sacred. The asylum's whispers, "Trust us, obey, it's for your safety," become the language of governance. Religion was not immune. Pulpits echoed the same cadence as asylum staff, suffering reframed as salvation, obedience dressed as virtue, questioning punished as heresy. Parishioners were not chained, but conditioned, taught to fear invisible punishment, to confess their doubt as if it were sickness. The asylum provided the blueprint for psychological cages. Churches simply sanctified them. And what about daily life? Schools that ring bells like wardens sounding shifts, teaching compliance before curiosity. Workplaces that drain men in fluorescent corridors, their individuality reduced to employee numbers. Media that floods with fear. drowning minds in confusion until exhaustion makes obedience the path of least resistance. None of this is random. None of it is accidental. It is the asylum's logic, perfected. Here is the most chilling thought. If a system can train obedience in broken minds, it can train it in healthy ones. The difference is only scale. You do not need a straitjacket if a man believes his invisible leash is freedom. And you do not need walls if a man builds them inside himself. The asylum proved it could be done. The world outside simply proved it could be done everywhere. Now comes the revelation you've been circling. The asylum was never just a building. It was a prototype of the world you live in. You are not looking back into history. You are looking into the present. And the walls? They are not stone anymore. They are invisible, and they surround you right now. Ask yourself, how much of your daily life is chosen by you? The alarm clock that rips you from sleep, the commute that grinds your body, the rules of workplaces that demand obedience in exchange for survival. These are corridors, endless, sterile, designed to drain you while convincing you it's all normal. The asylum has no bars because it doesn't need them. You are already conditioned to stay. Think of the noise, the constant flood of information, notifications, demands. It is no different than the endless screams, groans, and rattling chains that filled the asylum's wards. Confusion was a weapon there, and it is a weapon now. When every voice contradicts another, when truth becomes slippery, the brain exhausts itself and defaults to authority. Tell me what is real, the patient begs, and authority answers, do as we say, and you'll be safe. The lie is the same, only the costume has changed. Look around. Surveillance cameras on every corner, microphones in every device. Your digital footsteps tracked more carefully than any inmate's daily log. In the asylum, they called it observation. Today, it's called security. Do you see how language itself was turned into the mask? Words that once concealed torment now conceal control. And here is the deepest wound. You were taught to believe this was progress. You were told the asylum was barbaric, and that we live in enlightenment now. Yet every mechanism of control, every tool of psychological manipulation, every method of obedience has simply been modernized. The ghosts of that institution live in your schedule, your feeds, your fears. You are already inside a larger asylum. You just call it freedom. Men used to beg to escape those walls. Today, men defend them, mocking anyone who dares suggest the cage is real. That is how complete the conditioning has become. The asylum never closed. It expanded until its corridors became the world itself. Identity. That was always the first thing they broke inside the asylum. A man arrived with a name, a history, a self, and within days it was stripped. Clothes taken, haircut, letters from family intercepted or rewritten. He became a number, a file, a specimen. And when a man no longer recognizes himself, he becomes pliable. That was the secret formula. Erase who he was, then write over him with what the institution needed him to be. Now look at modern life. How different is it really? You are assigned numbers at birth, tracked through schools, jobs, taxes, licenses. Systems ask for your identity, but only in the form they created. ID cards, usernames, employee tags. Your story doesn't matter, only the record they maintain. And when they decide to change that record, your reality shifts instantly. The asylum's erasure has become bureaucracy's function. Think of how you are told to describe yourself today. By job title, by political party, by consumer preference. None of these are you. They are categories stamped onto you, just as patients were stamped with diagnoses: depressed, manic, schizophrenic, productive, obsolete, useful, useless. It's the same system, refined and distributed. A man convinced that his label is his identity will defend that label even as it cages him. The asylum also used contradiction. A patient was told he was sick, but punished for not acting normal. He was told recovery was possible, but denied freedom when he improved. This confusion shattered his sense of self. Today, you are told to be yourself while being pressured to conform. You are told you are free, yet watched at all times. You are told truth matters, yet drowned in lies. The same contradiction, the same fracture of identity, and when identity fractures, control slips in. Because a man who doubts himself is easier to command. He will cling to authority, to group, to narrative, just to silence the terror of not knowing who he is. The asylum didn't just confine men physically, it hollowed them out, then rebuilt them as compliant shadows. That same hollowing happens now, on a global scale. Ask yourself, what parts of you are truly yours? And what parts were written by hands you never saw? Until you confront that, you are still wearing the asylum's uniform, even if you think you're free. Inside the asylum, time was the first thing to dissolve. Days bled into nights. Nights bled into endless gray mornings. Windows were boarded or painted over. Clocks removed. Routines shuffled to confuse. Patients lost track of hours, then days, then months. When you do not know the time, you do not know yourself. You become a drifting shadow, suspended in someone else's schedule, waiting for cues that never come. Memory fractured next. Diaries were confiscated, letters home rewritten. Patients who insisted on their past were told they were delusional. Every memory became suspect, every protest reframed as madness. Over time, many stopped trusting their own minds. They accepted the rewritten versions of their stories, because resistance meant deeper punishment. Their lives were edited until they no longer belonged to them. Now look around you. Do you see it? Time is fractured again, not by iron bars, but by screens. The constant scroll dissolves hours without notice. Notifications shatter concentration into fragments. You wake and sleep according to artificial cycles, dictated not by sun or rest, but by alarms, deadlines, and dopamine jolts. You are always busy, but never present. That is the asylum's trick. Time without anchor. Existence without ownership. Memory, too, is being rewritten. Search engines reorder history. News cycles bury truth within hours. Digital archives vanish with the click of a policy change. What you once saw can be edited, blurred, reframed, until you doubt it ever happened. You are told to trust the record, forgetting that the record is controlled. Just like the patients, you begin to question your own recollection. Did it happen that way? Or did I imagine it? That doubt is the opening. Into that opening, authority writes a new story. When time is stolen and memory reshaped, identity crumbles. A man who cannot trust his days or his past is no longer whole. He becomes pliable, waiting for someone to tell him what is real, who he is, what he must do. The asylum did this with walls and wards. Today, the world does it with information and distraction, but the effect is identical. Men untethered, wandering, obedient. The asylum never merely confined bodies. It dismantled time and memory, and what they learned there is being practiced on you now. You are not just in their corridors. You are in their clock, in their ledger, in their script. Ritual. That was the hidden spine of the asylum. Every act, every humiliation, every repetition was not random. It was ceremonial. Patients were woken at the same time, fed at the same time, punished at the same time. Chairs bolted to the floor faced the same direction. Chants of prayer or discipline echoed in unison. Even the screams became part of the rhythm. Whether they knew it or not, the patients were participants in a ritual of control. Their lives bound into a liturgy of despair. Ritual strips choice. When actions are repeated enough, they bypass thought, sinking into the bones. You no longer ask why, you simply perform. And in that performance, obedience becomes instinct. This is why the asylum's architects insisted on rigid schedules. Not because it healed, but because it hollowed. It turned men into actors repeating lines they never wrote, trapped in ceremonies that reinforced their submission. Now look at society. You wake to alarms, line up at traffic lights, swipe cards at machines, recite pledges, bow heads in prayer, raise glasses in toasts. You perform rituals without ever calling them rituals. Work begins and ends at bells. Meals are slotted into breaks. Celebrations tied to dates you did not choose. Entire nations stand in unison for flags, chant slogans, kneel before screens to watch spectacles. You believe you are choosing, but you are participating in ceremonies designed long before you were born. The asylum's ritual has expanded. The world is its cathedral, and its ceremonies are everywhere. Black Fridays where men trample each other for goods they don't need. Election days where choices are narrowed to illusions. Holidays that cycle endlessly, pulling wallets open in synchronized obedience. Even mourning has been standardized, funerals packaged into efficient scripts. You are not living. You are performing roles in a ritual that feeds the same hind that once feasted on patients' despair. And here's the darkest truth. Rituals summon. Inside the asylum, the endless repetition, the suffering, the synchronized obedience. It opened something. That hunger we spoke of earlier, that unseen intelligence, ritual was its language. Ritual was the invitation. And now, on a global scale, the rituals of obedience and distraction may be opening the same door wider than ever before. So ask yourself, when you repeat the motions of life without question, whose ceremony are you serving? And what exactly is being fed by your performance? Sacrifice. That is the word hidden in the marrow of these rituals. The asylum's walls drank it daily. Time, identity, sanity, sometimes even life itself. Patients shuffled like offerings, their suffering the price of a system that claimed to cure, but existed only to consume. If you strip away the medical masks, what remains is unmistakable. It was a theater of sacrifice. Every society has fed something. The ancients knew it, though they named it differently. Gods, spirits, powers that demanded blood, obedience, ritual. What changed is not the need, but the disguise. In the asylum, the offering was human despair. Today, it is no less costly. Our sacrifices are measured in lost years at desks, fractured families, broken bodies numbed by chemicals, spirits drowned in screens. We believe ourselves civilized, but the structure is the same. A system requires offerings, and we give them willingly, because we have forgotten the altar we are standing on. The asylum revealed this altar clearly. Suffering was not incidental, it was essential. The walls did not echo with pain by accident. They demanded it. The system grew sharper, stronger, more certain with every life it hollowed. And now, what if the same law applies on a global scale? What if the world's rituals of work, war, distraction, and despair are not just accidents of progress, but sacrifices sustaining something we cannot see? Think about the scale. Entire populations synchronized in cycles of anxiety and release. News designed to spike fear, then soothe it. Wars timed to fuel industries, but also to bleed generations. Families offering their children into systems that strip curiosity and replace it with compliance. The sacrifice is not blood on stone. It is energy, spirit, attention. Every drop of despair feeds the machine. Here is the unspeakable thought. Maybe we were never the architects. Maybe the asylum was not designed by men alone, but by something that understood ritual better than we ever could. Something that learned to feed not on bodies, but on the psychic energy of obedience and fear. Something that saw in humanity an endless resource. If this is true, then the asylum was not a mistake. It was a doorway, and the world outside has become its temple. Step through the doorway and the air changes. It is not just the stench of mildew or the groan of ancient timbers. It is the sensation that you are being observed. Men who walked the asylum's corridors often described it the same way. Not haunted in the way ghost stories suggest, but alive. A presence that did not drift like a wandering spirit, but coiled, attentive, calculating. It was not simply there. It was waiting. This is where the word technology takes on a new weight. Not gears, not circuits, not machines of metal, but ritual structures engineered to channel forces beyond comprehension. Every repeated schedule, every synchronized act, every human mind broken into pliant submission was a component. The asylum itself functioned like a vast device, harvesting despair, amplifying it, and transmitting it into something unseen. Those locked doors and shifting hallways, they were not accidents of design. They were architecture tuned to channel sacrifice. Why else were so many wings sealed, their records erased? Why did patients vanish without trace, their names struck from ledgers, as though their existence had been swallowed whole? These are not the patterns of bureaucratic oversight. These are the fingerprints of ritual concealment. If something was being contacted, or fed, it could not survive public scrutiny. It required darkness, both literal and historical. Modern investigators often speak of energy in such places. Cold spots, static interference, sudden drains of batteries. But energy is only the symptom. What is truly terrifying is the intelligence behind it. An asylum designed as ritual technology is not merely haunted, it is inhabited. And what inhabits is not bound by the collapse of the building or the decay of its stones. It follows the blueprint. It adapts to new architectures, courthouses, schools, office towers, digital networks, anywhere ritual repetiti, on and human despair are cultivated. The presence can root itself and grow. This is the truth we were never meant to consider, that the asylum was not a failed experiment in mental health, but a successful experiment in ritual engineering. And the same structures that broke men there are now breaking us, invisibly, globally, every day. The institution never closed. It expanded its circuitry into the world itself. And if that is true, then every act of obedience, every cycle of despair, every ritual of distraction is not neutral. It is an offering, refusal. That is the forbidden act. Inside the asylum, the greatest threat was not violence, not madness, not even escape. It was the man who refused the ritual, the one who would not eat on schedule, the one who would not bow his head in prayer, the one who clung to his name when they tried to erase it. These men were not just punished. They were obliterated, isolated in padded cells, restrained until their bodies broke, their records purged so the others would never hear their defiance. Why? Because refusal shatters the ceremony, and the ceremony must never be broken. Think about what that means. It wasn't obedience to staff that mattered most. It was obedience to the rhythm, to the ritual itself. Because the asylum was not feeding on order, it was feeding on submission. As long as men repeated the cycle, the energy flowed. But the moment one man said no, he introduced fracture. He stopped being a patient and became something else, an interruption. And interruptions are poison to ritual. Now look at the world outside. What happens when a man refuses the cycle? When he rejects the media's fear? When he refuses to march to the rhythm of consumer rituals, political rituals, social rituals? He is mocked, silenced, shadow banned, called dangerous, unstable, conspiratorial. His career evaporates, his reputation erased. He is not merely criticized, he is unpersoned. The same punishment patients faced inside the asylum is now applied to anyone who steps outside the modern ceremony. Why such violence against refusal? Because the ritual requires unanimity. The machinery cannot tolerate gaps. If even a small number of men refuse to participate, the illusion weakens. And once weakened, the presence feeding on it risks exposure. That is why refusal is met with disproportionate fury, because it is not just disobedience, it is sabotage. And here is where your choice becomes unbearable. To refuse is to risk everything. To obey is to lose everything slowly. Either way, you are on the altar. The only question is whether you remain part of the ceremony or step outside it. Knowing the cost, the asylum taught us this. Survival was not guaranteed by obedience. Survival was guaranteed by remembering you were never born to serve the ritual. But those who remembered were the first to disappear. There are only two outcomes for a man caught in the asylum's shadow: collapse or awakening. Collapse is the path most take, because it is easy. It asks nothing but surrender. You obey the cycles. You numb yourself. You let your spirit thin out until you are a ghost walking among the living. That is what most men have become. Hollow vessels, repeating patterns that are not theirs, feeding a system that drains them until they are discarded. The ritual thrives on their collapse because it turns them into batteries, spent, forgettable, easily replaced. But awakening is different. Awakening begins when a man sees the chains for what they are. When he realizes the rituals were never sacred, only engineered. When he feels the hunger of the presence pressing on him and says, with unshakable force, "Not me." That moment is dangerous, because the system will target him, isolate him, erase him if it can. But it is also the first true act of freedom, a refusal that feeds nothing, a silence that starves the presence. The asylum's darkest secret is this. Not all men collapsed. A few resisted in ways too quiet to erase. They wrote their names into hidden places, scratched messages into walls that still remain. They prayed to no God but to themselves, refusing to bow their heads. They guarded memory, identity, truth in whispers the system could not kill. And when those men left, if they left at all, they carried fire in their eyes. Fire that could never again be extinguished, because once you see the ritual, you can never unsee it. Today, you face the same choice. Collapse into obedience, becoming another offering, or awaken into refusal, becoming untouchable. Not because the system cannot harm your body, but because it cannot claim your spirit. That is the only victory. That is the only freedom the asylum never anticipated. A man who knows he is more than the ritual, more than the sistes, more than the sacrifice demanded of him. Understand this. Awakening is not comfort. It is war. But it is the only war worth fighting, because it is the war for your soul. And every man who awakens weakens the presence, fractures the ritual, opens a path for others to follow. One spark becomes fire. One refusal becomes revolution. The asylum feared this more than anything. And the world still does. This is the final descent, and it leaves no illusions. You came here to peer into the asylum, but the asylum has been peering into you. Its shadows cling not to walls, but to men. Its rituals are not history, but the bloodstream of our present. And its hunger, its endless silent hunger, waits for you to forget what you've seen here tonight. Because forgetting is the ultimate offering. Look around one last time. The corridors are gone, but the repetition remains. The screams are silenced, but the fear still hums in headlines, in schedules, in rituals you perform without thought. The iron bars have rusted away, but the chains are woven into language, into culture, into obedience itself. The asylum is not past. It is pattern. A pattern so vast it pretends to be the world. And most men accept it because they cannot face the terror of seeing the truth. But you have seen it. You cannot go back. You know the system does not want healing. It wants harvesting. You know obedience is not virtue. It is sacrifice. You know identity, time, memory, even your own attention, are the altar stones on which you are offered, and you know refusal is possible, though it costs more than most will ever pay. That is the mark of awakening. That is the spark the asylum feared, so here is the final truth, and it is heavy. The asylum never ended, and it never will, unless men choose to end it within themselves. Every ritual you refuse, every fear you starve, every chain you name is a fracture in the structure. Alone, you may feel powerless, but together, fractures become collapse. Collapse becomes freedom. Freedom becomes fire. Do not leave this as entertainment. Do not let the ritual reclaim you. Carry this descent in your blood. Speak it to no one who cannot bear it, but let it shape how you see everything. And if you must leave a mark tonight, leave it not for me, but for yourself. The asylum is everywhere. But it will not take me. Now step out of the corridor. Do not look back. The doors are closing, and if you listen closely, you'll hear the silence noticing your absence.